Hello and welcome to the Exam Study Expert podcast. I'm your host, learning and memory specialist and exam success coach and speaker, William Wadsworth. By definition, many students and scholars of all ages who tune into the show are ambitious for their academic success. You guys want to do well. You're taking the time, after all, to tune into a show all about study strategy. That already sets you apart from a lot of people. And this idea of constantly seeking to improve your skill set and find ways to grow and level up and get better at things, again, like listening to this podcast to sharpen your study skills, that's an extremely desirable attribute that often comes with ambition and wanting to do well. But some of the attributes that accompany ambition can not be so universally beneficial. We can sometimes have a tendency to work so hard that we risk burnout. See the fantastic episode 159 with Hannah Tackett for a masterclass on that. Or perhaps we wrestle with imposter syndrome. All the way back in episode 44, we were talking about that. Especially, imposter syndrome, especially kicking in later on in your academic journey, common among undergraduates and especially among postgraduate students. But something that many listeners at all stages of their academic journey face, from school through university and on into the professional world, something that's quite universal among people that want to do well is a tendency towards perfectionism. It kind of comes with the territory. We want to do well, and sometimes that comes at the cost of, wanting to do really, really well, so good it's perfect. And that, as you might well know, can create challenges for us. Now, some of you listening may well identify with the idea of being a perfectionist. You know that label resonates strongly with you, in which case, please make yourself at home and welcome to perhaps your new favourite episode on the show. Perhaps consider coming back and listening to this a couple of times. Or perhaps you don't really identify with yourself as the idea of being a perfectionist, but even then, you might recognise the tendency to have perfectionist-type traits popping up at certain times, perhaps triggered by certain kinds of tasks. So for me personally, I would say that I was definitely a bit of a perfectionist as a teen, but I think honestly I've long since lost that overall. However, the tendency to perfectionism still does rear its head for certain kinds of tasks, including, kind of ironically, the task of coming up with introduction segments for podcast episodes, as my podcast editor Carrie will gladly tell you. I've merrily procrastinated for about the last 3 weeks on recording this particular introduction, and a part of that is the pressure I put on myself when I'm writing a podcast introduction. This is kind of one of my key channels to kind of communicate with the world and my community, and I always want to make the introduction really kind of compelling, hook people in, and get you super excited for what you're about to hear. So I try and have this drive to kind of try and make it perfect, basically. So I end up putting it off and procrastinating on it. Wherever you procrastinate in your life or in your studies, today's guest is here to help. She is Dr. Tara Cousineau, and her credentials to teach us about perfectionism and how we can manage it in our lives, in an academic context particularly, are second to none. Dr. Tara was originally trained at Harvard Medical School and became, amongst other things, a therapist and a researcher, later including a role as a staff psychologist at the Harvard University's Counselling and Mental Health Service. More recently, Dr. Tara is the author of The Perfectionist's Dilemma, Learn the Art of Self-Compassion and Become a Happy Achiever, which is a really good book. I definitely recommend anyone pick up for a really good blend of the kind of the science of perfectionism, along with Tara's really vast real-world experience of helping people and students in particular to overcome this particular challenge and make progress. We're going to talk about lots of Tara's kind of favorite ideas. We're going to talk about the research today. We're going to talk about some really good sort of practical steps you can use to help manage your perfectionist tendencies and help you make good progress. So we're in for a real treat today. I think this will be a fantastic conversation for so many of you. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Tara to the Exam Study Expert podcast.
Hi, I'm Tara Cousineau. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm in the Boston-Cambridge area in the United States. That's Massachusetts. And I'm really happy to be on your podcast, William.
We are so excited to have you here, Dr. Tara. Thank you so much for giving up your time. I'm really excited to have this conversation. And I wonder, perhaps if we before we zoom into the specific conversation about perfectionism, which I think will be of great interest to many of us listening today, I wonder if we could maybe start with just a little bit of breadth, perhaps your kind of perspective, having had a role as a staff psychologist on a university counselling mental health services team at one of the world's great universities. I'm just kind of curious, what are some of the sort of challenges and patterns and trends that you've sort of seen in the years you've been doing this, some of those kind of perennial themes that create difficulties for students, particularly studying at kind of elite institutions?
Wow. So I've been a clinical psychologist for a long time, about 25 years. I've worked at the University Counseling Center for about 6. So in the short time, relatively short time of 6 years, I think if there's some interesting trends. So we had COVID, which really actually incited a lot of anxiety because there was such a lack of structure. And so a lot of students and high achievers actually felt somewhat at a loss during that time because the structure wasn't there. And now we have AI, which is, in the last year has been also an interesting trend in a number of ways. How that affects studying, I'm not as clear as how it affects when people sometimes come into my office and they've asked ChatGPT, how to cope. Or I'm going on a first date, or, I need an outline for a paper. And so there's been some interesting developments, I think, over the last few years that I feel like we're all kind of curious about and trying to figure out how to navigate that.
Yeah. And in terms of the sorts of things, the sorts of conversations, you have with students and the sorts of issues they bring to the table. I mean, clearly, sort of perfectionism is one, and that was one of the kind of inspirations for the book and your work on this. Are there any other sort of patterns that you see people, causing people to come and knock on your door, so to speak?
Well, they're typical. I think they're human concerns. It's often imposterism, not feeling like you fit in. Sort of some hits to your self-esteem if you didn't do as well as that you thought you could, having to do things that you didn't really have to do before, presentations in front of large audiences, situations like that. And also just developmental. I mean, when you're transitioning from a high school to a college, or college to graduate school, or even mid-career to graduate school, it's a new phase in life and you don't know what you don't know yet. And that could be really uncomfortable for people.
So you've got kind of particular passion and expertise for the topic of perfectionism. Something you thought about quite a lot, written on. I'm curious, what kind of got you, got you particularly interested in that subject in particular? What drew you to work on that?
Well, I think, first of all, I was raised by a perfectionist. My mother is German. We couldn't leave the house until things were organized and efficient. We always had to look our best no matter what. You kind of squash down your feelings in order to present yourself well to the world. So I had that conditioning. I love my mother, by the way, but there was a lot of that conditioning. And then there's just growing up in the world, and then, going to college and earning a PhD. There's lots of comparison, am I smart enough? So I have that life experience. I feel like, I've been exactly where my students have been at one point or another. So I resonate very much. But what really got me started was probably in the first year of working at the University Counseling Center, where every student came in either saying that they were a perfectionist or struggling with not feeling good enough. And it was impossible for me on an hour-to-hour basis to address enough students. So I decided to start some workshops. I'm like, okay, if I could get more people who are feeling the same way in a room together, then we can start to tackle this as a group. So I started running groups called Overcome Perfectionism, and one for graduate students called Befriending the Inner Critic. And I've been running those for about 5 years. And that has just been incredibly rewarding, because many people struggle with this. You don't have to go to an elite university. You don't have to even go to a college to actually experience a lot of the sort of characteristics associated with perfectionism, or wanting to strive, or being highly motivated. So, I was just really immersed sort of in the perfectionism pond, so to speak. So I felt like I had to do more.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I wonder if you could maybe just give us a little bit of color on the sorts of ways it's affected. I know either from your own story or from the students you've seen, sort of how it's kind of affected people. Perhaps in terms of kind of late for deadlines or kind of emotional state. Yeah, maybe just a little bit of human color on what perfectionism means for people and what how it impacts their lives.
Well, so I've come to, there are some sort of research definitions around perfectionism, and I've sort of come to my own, I just call it my armchair definition of perfectionism, which is it's really a paradox created by a need for belonging and a fear of rejection, paired with unrealistic expectations for achievement or approval. And this saps your energy or life force. So I feel like a lot of the research oriented definitions don't actually address how draining it is. So people will come in often in a panic. They've left a 10-page paper to the last minute, right? They're trying to pull those all-nighters. You're probably familiar with this behavior. Or they got their first B or C plus here in the United States, the ABCD system. So they got, a less than stellar grade on something, and it's so counter to their experience to that point, it feels devastating. Or they're studying, medical student has a shelf exam, they've just done a rotation and now they're going to be tested on it, and it will be, sort of an oral exam or a written exam, and they're in a panic because they're afraid they're going to freeze. Those are the kinds of situations that might bring a student to a counseling appointment, and rightly so.
So you mentioned that definition, which is really interesting, and you mentioned some of the kind of research, the kind of academic literature on this. I'm just curious. I mean, we have a fairly scholarly listener base today. I'm just curious, like, are there any sort of interesting things in the academic literature in terms of the sort of research that's been done on this that might be helpful for us in sort of starting to understand perfectionism,
Yes.
where it comes from, how it affects us?
I think it's a fairly small area of study, generally speaking. But in that domain, there have been researchers in Canada, for example, who have been studying perfectionism, and they actually developed this multidimensional scale of perfectionism. And they've really sort of identified three types of perfectionism, if you will. One type is self-oriented perfectionism. And self-oriented perfectionism is really, you actually have raised the bar for yourself. Your standards are really high. You strive for excellence. You're sort of internally and externally motivated to do well in the world. You put a lot of pressure on yourself, basically. That's sort of the self-oriented perfectionist. I know I identify with that category. I got myself, as the first, person in my family to go to college and then get a PhD. So I definitely fit under that category. And then there is other-oriented perfectionism, where you have this expectation that other people have these high standards of excellence just like you do. And so you can get very easily frustrated when people don't meet the standards that you have, or expectations you have for them. And that could be almost the stereotypical sort of bully that you might see in a movie, Meryl Streep's character in The Devil Wears Prada, Miranda, just this high unrealistic standard for other people that no one can ever meet. So there's that category. And we all have a little bit of all of this if you're at all in this domain of perfectionism. And then there's socially prescribed perfectionism, which is the kind of perfectionism where you're doing that, what I call the compare and despair. You're constantly measuring your own ability, capacity, and success to other people. So those are sort of three buckets, and we have to see them more as spectrums, right? So we might have a little bit of this, we might have a little bit of that. But my understanding from the researchers is that the kind of perfectionism that has the most consequences in terms of mental health is the socially prescribed perfectionism. What I do think is interesting, and there's actually a UK researcher, Thomas Curran, who also wrote a book on perfectionism, where there seems to be trends, this is so correlational versus causation, but that perfectionism really started, it was like on this little trend upward, and then all of a sudden there was this big spike, and that was around, 2012, or so, in the mid tens, if you will, that coincides with the onset of the smartphone. when all of a sudden people started having their phones in their hands. You're looking at it 24/7. You go to sleep with your smartphone under your pillow at night. And so we can make some inferences that social media, the introduction of smartphones, spiked that socially, that social perfectionism. And so that's, in a way, the ones that we have to kind of watch out for, at least. And sure enough, like, that's one of the things. I'm like, how long are you on your phone? If you're spending, more than a few hours on your phone a day, that's a problem. It could really sort of trigger um, self-defeating thoughts and that compare and despair cycle.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to talk about some sort of practical strategies in a moment. It sounds like we may be already hinting the way towards one of them, which is try and get off the phone a bit, which has benefits for lots of things, not just perfectionism.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of just sort of rounding out our understanding of the kind of phenomena of perfectionism, you've mentioned this idea of the inner critic a couple of times. I wonder if you could just expand on that concept a little bit more for us.
Yeah, sure. So, perfectionism is really this sort of unrealistic set of standards, right, or ideals, ultimately, that's difficult to attain. Well, how does that actually manifest in our internal life? And it usually manifests, well, physically with tension, stress, and anxiety, but also mentally with what we say to ourselves. So that sort of inner dialogue. And when we are stressed, the body is actually interpreting that as threat, right? It's a sort of a response to threat. And then we have to make sense of it. So we come up with a story. And the story is usually, I'm not good enough. I shouldn't have been here. I'm a fake. I'm a fraud. And all sorts of things, come in because we have this, what some neuroscientists would call the negativity bias, right? Is that our bias for our attention networks is to focus on what's wrong rather than what's right. And we all have it. We all have the negativity bias to some extent. And so that really can sort of feed that inner narrative or narratives, because often there's more than one narrative that's happening at the same time. That's especially true for the perfectionist procrastinator sort of loop that will happen, is that there's one part of you that's saying, this is exactly what someone said to me last week, I'm saying, go, 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 go. And then there's another part of me that says, wait, just chill, just relax. It's going to be okay, right? So then you have this internal conflict that's happening. Those are competing voices, right? And they both are valid. So how do you kind of manage that? So learning to identify and tease out with some specificity what the narratives are can be really helpful in identifying patterns.
Yeah. Well, should we talk a little bit about what we might be able to do? So if we're listening to this and resonating with some of the things you've been describing, Dr. Tara, I would love to sort of explore what are some of the things we might be able to take from this conversation to help us move forward a little bit. So we've already signposted the way to one. You mentioned the impact of social media, smartphone use generally. So I guess the takeaway there would be, let's try and get off the phone. Let's try and get off social media a little bit.
Right. Be right? People talk about a media diet, and that's all very practical. We need diets. We have to kind of do everything in moderation. And so it's an obvious one, but students actually really do struggle with it. They have a hard time because now they've got the dopamine hits and it's become a little bit of an addiction. And so to titrate off can be, challenging. And that can affect your social life. It can affect your study life. It can affect a number of things. But I'm going to go back to the inner critic. Because, when I started running these groups in a university setting, there were different sort of scripts or stories that would come up. And so then I kind of identified these archetypes, if you will. Like there could be that inner bully, which is almost oriented like that other oriented perfectionism. You expect other people to do everything right, you expect yourself to do everything right. Or an inner detective, that's that doom scroller, or leave no stone unturned. Like some people cannot stop studying, and they're not studying effectively, as you know, and they kind of go down these rabbit holes. So I call that sort of your inner detective. There could be an inner joy thief that almost everybody relates to, and also it's summertime, right? People are on vacation. I've got graduate students who say, like, I can't enjoy a weekend. I can't relax because I've got all these other things to do, right? And so that's a part of you that's saying it's not okay, and guilt trips you. There can be a nitpicker, right? So I definitely have an inner nitpicker with the way that I grew up, that I can't even think straight unless my desk is clean. Like before this podcast, I had to actually just put away all my sticky notes because I had 100 of them. It's totally inefficient, right? And so I need to actually work with that part, So when we identify that we've got these sort of, little inner personas or characters, and that they're all trying to help you in some way. So here's where I kind of have like an issue with the mindset work, because yes, it's great to change your mind, but if you don't understand the underlying mechanisms of why you're sort of like, your inner judge is getting on you, it's going to be very hard to change your mind. You're going to go back to that pattern. So many people come in, they've got an inner judge. Sometimes I'm like, give it a nickname, Judge Judy, and notice when that comes up, because it doesn't come up in every area of life. It comes up, in this computer science class, or it might come up when you have to go to the dining hall and, you don't want to sit by yourself. When does the judge show up? And how might this element have been constructed in your life to help you? And this is where, like, it's a mind-bending thing. Like, well, I need my perfectionism. I can't let go of it. If I didn't have my perfectionism, I wouldn't have gotten this far. And I'm like, yes, that is probably true. But do you have to suffer to get this far? Check in with your feelings. So when people start to recognize, like, oh, this judge part of me showed up in the third grade when I had a math teacher, and that math teacher said, well, I'm really surprised, Susie, that you didn't do better than this. Right? That becomes a traumatic memory in a way, and then, what does little Susie do? Well, she tries like heck to make sure that she doesn't make any mistakes, and that she studies, and then she begs her mom for a tutor and all these things, and and then overcompensates. Well, when you can recognize that, that allows you to get a little bit of mental space and some emotional space to say, oh, I know why this little judge is here, because this class really means a lot to me and I want to do well. And then we start to insert practices of self-compassion. So Thomas Curran, who wrote a book on the perfectionist trap, and he comes from the sort of social economic perspective, like we're just marinating in this soup of perfectionism and everything has to be more, 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 and better, better, better. I had the same question to him that you had to me, like, okay, well, how do you help with this? And he also mentions self-compassion, because the practice of self-compassion helps to offset that inner critical narrative. And there is a lot of research on this, is that self-compassion is a really great antidote to the harsh inner narratives, and it can help alleviate anxiety and depression and traumatic memories and all sorts of things. And it's a hard sell, William, with high achievers.
Yeah.
Be kinder to yourself. They're like, well, I'm going to let myself off the hook. I'm like, no, that's not what it is at all. So then we actually have to learn what self-compassion is.
So not always an easy thing to implement. Can you give us some examples of ways we could practice more self-compassion? What that could look like in practice?
Yes. Well, self-compassion is this, and again, according to the research, Dr. Kristen Neff's research, is that there's actually 3 elements of self-compassion. Isn't that interesting? One is mindfulness, which is being aware of this, of the present moment without judging it. Like, can we be aware of our moment-to-moment experiences without trying to define it, change it, or judge it? So mindfulness is a really important element of self-compassion. It's often, I think, there's no order here, but it's a good first step. The second piece is common humanity, which is recognizing that you are not alone with your struggle or your fears or your worries or your imposterism. It is a human experience. While your situation might be specific to you, it is actually a very common human experience. And that's why I love doing the groups, because I feel like it really engenders common humanity. And then the third component is self-kindness. And what is self-kindness? And it's like, well, I think the easiest way to remember that is to, like, be a good friend to yourself. I call it befriending. If you knew a friend was struggling with her exam anxiety or her dissertation or her oral defense, how would you orient yourself to that person? How would you tend to that person? And, and often people say, well, I would be really encouraging. I would be kind. I would give them a hug. I would say I'm there for them. Like, great. Can you redirect that back to yourself? Can you make that U-turn and do that for yourself? So those are the elements of self-compassion. And one way to kind of, and I'd be so interested from your study expertise to see what you think about this, but is actually creating for yourself what I call sometimes self-compassion statements or power statements, where you actually are writing down for yourself a statement that is encouraging, that you can metabolize, that it's not like fake it till you make it, that you actually can digest it, right? Because, you tell people to go in front of a mirror and say, you are beautiful. They're like, no way, I can't do that. So you have to come up with phrases that actually mean something to you. And so it's being kind, it's being clear, and it's being authentic to yourself. And I often ask students to write at least 3 of those, and then to put it somewhere in their visual cues. Screensaver on your cell phone is the first thing that you look at in the morning. Put it on a sticky note, say it out loud, talk about it with friends, start to create. It's like learning a new language, essentially, is orienting your attention to, okay, we can call it a positivity bias. And that takes time. That is all about, like you said, making space. It's about repetition over and over again. And if you can reinforce that with allies, your roommates, your friends, it can be really powerful, but it does require practice.
Yeah. No, that's great advice. That's great advice. And as you've been talking, I've been kind of ruminating on some of the kind of specific ways I think kind of different elements of perfectionism show up in some of the conversations I have with my coaching clients. And like a couple of the big ones I think are, kind of beyond the kind of everyone's sort of general impression of what perfectionism would involve. I think there's a couple of interesting sort of specific little details where it kind of shows up. I mean, one is, we talk a lot, as you know, about kind of power of retrieval practice on the show, testing yourself, and that being the high road, if you like, to learning effectively, learning, in a kind of rapid space of time. And that inevitably involves being wrong, like testing yourself. Like means you'll sometimes get the answer wrong. And sometimes people will put off doing the testing, doing the retrieval practice, because they don't like the element of being wrong. They want to just read it or kind of write it out a billion times until they can get it like right. But that, of course, is in an inefficient way to study, and means the whole thing takes a lot longer, versus like embracing the element of kind of being wrong and kind of accepting that as part of the process. And then I think sort of more generally, for students perhaps that are further on in the academic journey, as you get into sort of more research roles, kind of further on in the academic journey, that increasingly involves a huge amount of uncertainty. You're trying to figure out things that no one's figured out before. It's not supposed to be easy. Like, it's really hard. No one's worked this stuff out before. And the sort of psychological struggles that people wrestle with there, are very can be very tricky. Like, I've never been in one of those roles myself, but from the conversations I've had, that can be a big thing.
Well, there's a number of techniques that can be used, and this is where everyone needs to kind of figure out what their own toolkit is. Like, you need to try a number of things because not everything works for everybody. I think there's like no simple answers, but often when you're struggling with like, I really don't want to do this, or there's maybe a part of you that's saying, ugh, I don't have the energy. That's when I say use an even though statement. Even though this is a struggle for me right in this moment, I know that when I put in the effort, I will feel so much better later. And I completely accept where I am right now. And now you can pair that even with, there's certain energy psychology techniques like tapping, which so many students have found helpful because tapping is emotional freedom technique. There's been a couple of meta-analyses on the benefits of tapping, which actually helps to reduce that amygdala response to the fear. Right? Because whether you're facing uncertainty, you don't really know what you don't know yet, or you're trying to discover something new, you have no idea if it's going to work out, or you have to, do an exam. All of that is actually, causing a fight, flight, freeze reaction. So I often work with people from a sort of like a bottom up perspective versus the top down. Like, mindset work is top down, and that's really important. But you also actually have to work bottom up, which is actually tending to the nervous system in some way, and is absolutely essential. And I feel like for many students in particular, it's a missing ingredient. And, procrastination is often a freeze response. Well, that's different than a fight flight response. And actually the coping skills for a freeze response are going to be different than coping skills for a fight flight response, right? So if you're in that freeze response, skills that will help you get a little more energy and to move And motion is going to be helpful if you're in freeze. If you're in fight flight, actually, the calming skills will be helpful. Learning, the breathing techniques, box breathing, things like that. So I feel like it's almost, you have to kind of have a number of skills, like a good 10 skills, and then you have to know when to use them, right? And that's when you have to check in with your body. What is your body saying it needs right now? Does that make some sense? And then try all these retrieval skills, right? I think it's important to practice. I mean, life isn't easy, right? So that's the other piece of it, is like, that's why I like the even though statement. Like, even though this is a struggle and I'm learning, I know that practice is really going to help me. And it just kind of helps with the dialectic there versus the, all or none that humans will often default to.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. So maybe some days we need to go for a walk, get the body moving. Yeah. Some days we might need to calm ourselves down and do some breath work. One other thing I just wanted to put to you, and kind of on behalf of all of you listening, which I know this is a thing for a lot of people. It sounds kind of obvious when you say it, but the amount of conversations I've had where people are wanting to go into an exam, particularly being 100% prepared. In other words, they have done every resource, they've done every question, they've learned every detail, and that's rarely an achievable goal, except at relatively young. When you're maybe 14 or 15, you're taking quite a straightforward exam at high school, relatively straightforward exam at high school. You might be able to do that, but the further up you go in academia, the harder and harder it gets to do that as the scope and scale of your course grows and grows. You'll never perfect every detail for a more advanced, more challenging exam. And here's the thing: you don't need to. Nobody needs 100% in an exam. That's not the goal. The goal is to pass or get the 4.0 or the A or the whatever, and that doesn't need 100%.
That's so true.
That idea of enough you were talking about.
Yes,
right,
totally.
back at the start.
It is. What is enough? And so there's a couple of things. So, because you like the research, right? So there's a Canadian researcher, Patrick Gaudreau, and he looks at perfectionism in the context of goal attainment. And he has what's called sort of the, it's the point of diminishing returns. So if you're looking at a graph, right? So there's a tipping point where you're striving for excellence is no longer beneficial, right? You've put in all of this effort and actually it's going to backfire at a certain point. You've put in 110%, and guess what? You're going to be exhausted, more likely to make a mistake, all of that. So I like sort of the idea of this point of diminishing returns, which brings in sort of the 80 or the 85% rule that people often talk about. They talk about it in business, talk about it, it's like you're really shooting for 80%. And that gives you some space. It gives you wiggle room. It gives you, an understanding that, right, I need to get through this milestone. It doesn't have to be, a 100%. Now that is, it's a hard sell, but when students begin to understand, right, there is a point of diminishing returns. And often, and of course we see students when they're usually in the panic state already, like you have the privilege of seeing them before they get there probably, but
sometimes, not always.
Really, it's like, yeah, no wonder. It's like, they've gotten to this panic point and their body has spoken, right? Because sometimes I say, yeah, if you don't get it yet, like if your body will tell you in some way, and the body is such an exquisite emotional radar system. So if you're denying how much you're struggling, or, you're trying to get to this point and you're not in sync with your body is going to shout it out. So what happens? People get insomnia, they get IBS, headaches, migraines, there's all sorts of things. And those are really important cues. You hope that it doesn't get to that level of significance. So this idea of point of diminishing returns to me says, okay, what do you need to do to set up your life that you're in a place of regulation, essentially, emotional regulation, attention regulation, like you've got a good balance in your life, and you're remembering the meaning of the work that you're doing. So this comes up often like with dissertation students, right, or thesis students, where sometimes they fall out of love with their project or why they went to graduate school in the first place. And Adam Grant, who's an organizational psychologist, has what he calls a minimal lovable product. And I love that phrase because I feel like, when you're going for your thesis or your dissertation or presentation, go for the minimal lovable product. Like, what still gets you sparked and inspired, and that you feel like, yes, this is meaningful to me. I have something to share with this particular audience or reader. That's what I'm going for. It's not actually about me so much as about the meaning that I'm actually putting out into the world. So you're almost like extracting your ego from the situation, like, oh yeah, I'm striving towards this and I do have something interesting to share. So I love the concept of minimal lovable product because that's how I say minimal lovable dissertation. Get to where you need to go. You want to write that book, you do it after. You can always write it later. So I think sometimes we just have to get to that 80% point rather than trying to go overboard, and you might just end up harming yourself rather than helping yourself if it gets too extreme.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I love that idea of the minimal lovable product as well. I think that's great. It put in mind the calmest doctorate PhD candidate I knew, sort of in the final weeks before deadline. He always stuck in my mind because he just I remember sort of asking him how his write-up was going, and he just sort of very calmly said, I've got a good, sensible body of work to call a PhD, and that kind of attitude of like, I've done a good,
Mm-hmm.
I've done enough, I've done enough, I've done a good enough amount of work, and he handed it in and got a pass without any minor corrections, which is not something you come across every day. So he's done a great job. But that kind of calm, I think, was really interesting to see, in that attitude of, I can always do more. There's always more. There's always more. There will always be more. But I've done enough. Was really cool. We sort of, I think the conversation we're having about those sort of diminishing marginal returns kind of feeds into this quite nicely. But you mentioned a little bit earlier that sometimes we have this idea that perfectionism as kind of a force for good. We feel it helps us
Yes.
to achieve our goals. So clearly, like, maybe a little bit of perfectionism in sort of inverted commas, will help compared to having, if you think the counter, if the counterfactual is having very, very low standards for ourselves. How would you help us sort of reconcile this idea that you maybe want a bit of
I'm
it,
going to go
but
back to,
when you go too much, it's not good.
yeah, no, I do think that we have to think of things more as multifaceted and on a spectrum. I think that that's a much more flexible way of looking at things. I mean, people often say, okay, like perfectionism will be like the favorite flaw that you'll say in a job interview, but
Yeah.
actually, if you can see it more as striving for excellence versus perfectionism, and actually Patrick Gaudreau, I loved when I saw his research. I was like, yes, thank you. You did the research behind this, where he calls it excellencism versus perfectionism, right? So you've got the isms in there, but it's really a striving for excellence. And so what is that? Well, that is that good enough attitude. It's having flexibility versus rigidity. It's having realistic expectations. It's not attaching your self-worth to your accomplishments, right? Whereas perfectionism is very much a singular kind of identity focus, that I am what I produce, in a way. And so I think we just need to kind of loosen the reins on the perfectionism. And there are a lot of perfectionism, influencers, let's say, in the world. Of course, we don't see what people's struggles are in their real lives, but we have to remember that our brains are very vulnerable, to the messages and the information, how systems are structured, that we don't even recognize that we might have fallen into that perfectionism trap because we're just marinating in it all the time. So it is really important on the cognitive behavioral side, to bring in some of those skills, is like, well, all right, if I'm such a dumb person, what's the evidence for that? Like, then you start checking the evidence, and there usually hardly is any evidence other than your own inner critic, right? Which is not evidence. So we have to kind of remind ourselves that there's actually a lot of positive things that are happening in our life all the time, and progress is being made, but we're not paying attention to that. What we're paying attention to is what we're not getting done or not, and so we really do have to see, where is our attention going? And that is actually sort of a really good mindfulness skill. It's like, where are you noticing your attention is? But to your question about, like, when students say, well, gosh, my perfectionism got me this far. And I'm like, okay, let's keep the word perfectionism. When you notice it in your life, how are you feeling? Let's just do a little litmus test. How are you feeling? And if they say they're tense and anxious and in panic, I'm like, okay, it's not really working for you, is it? If they're saying, well, I'm feeling inspired and motivated and I can't wait to pursue this, I'm like, oh, then it's inspirational, right? So I think sometimes we have to kind of check in with what our body and our mind and our hearts are telling us.
Never a one size fits all.
It's never one size fits all.
your own psychology around this. All this is so important. I did just want to ask though. So you've shared a kind of a number of nice sort of practical nuggets along the way as we've been talking. I kind of wondered if there's one, and mindful of the fact that different things for different people, but if there's kind of one or two sort of practical habits or tools that you think you wish the kind of the typical student, the vast majority of students would know and use when it comes to supporting with this area. Is there anything in particular that comes to mind that we haven't touched on already?
Well, I would like to remind your listeners, sort of wherever they are in their life, they have all the gifts that they already need, all the talents that they're in you. Sometimes we just need to kind of pull over the curtain to see that they're there and to really trust yourself. So I think self-trust is a really important element. And just trying to silence those inner critics and that inner doubt, right? That's just fear speaking. And if you can actually become comfortable with uncertainty and fear and know it's just another sort of element in your life, I think that will be really helpful. And the second thing is I would really encourage people to practice self-compassion. So, there are studies that show that even like micro moments, like putting a hand on your heart or just inclining your head towards yourself and saying, like, oh, hey, Tara, you're doing the best that you can. It's going to be okay. Keep at it. Some simple gesture like that, done repeatedly every single day, actually promotes well-being. And it's so simple. I feel like it's the best prescription, that we can have. And then let somebody else know that about themselves. Like, be kind to somebody else. I know it sounds simple, it sounds trivial, but the research is unequivocal. My first book was called The Kindness Cure: How the Science of Compassion Can Heal Your Heart and Your World. And there are all of these skills accumulate benefits over time when you practice them repeatedly. Just like if you're practicing those really great study skills, repetitions matter. So be kind to yourself and repeat.
Well, Dr. Tara, thank you so much for that and for your wisdom generally today. It's been genuinely really, really interesting talking to you, and I've taken a lot from our conversation, and I'm sure many, many of our listeners will have as well. If anyone is interested in your work that wants to find out a little bit more, where would we go next?
Oh, sure. Well, people can find out about my book on any sort of online retailer, The Perfectionist Dilemma, or go to a website for the book, which is perfectionistdilemma.com, or my website, which is my name, taracousineau.com. Or if you're interested in learning more about perfectionism, I have a Substack newsletter called the Peaceful Perfectionist. So you can find me on Substack too. So yeah, but it's been a joy to be on this podcast with you, William.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again. We will put the links in the show notes to make it easy for people to find. Thank you so much once again. We really appreciate it. Well, thanks again, Dr. Tara. And as always, links to Tara's resources, including her book, are in the show notes. So do take a look at the episode description on whatever platform you're listening to and click through those links to check out her work. I want to take a moment just before we go today to thank our supporters on Patreon over the past year. Also, since we relaunched our Patreon, really grateful to those who've been supporting us in that time and really helping to make this show possible. If you yourself have found value from the show and the tips we've shared, and that's helped you in your studies, helped you along the way with your exams, and if you're in a position to do so, we'd be really glad to welcome you to our supporters community, and in exchange we'll be able to hook you up with some really nice exclusive benefits just for our supporters. Go and check out the options and how you can support the work we do over at examstudyexpert.com/Patreon, Patreon. The link's in the show notes. That's examstudyexpert.com/Patreon. And thank you very much to all those who support. And with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone for tuning in today. It's been a joy, as always, to have your company, and I'd love to wish you, as ever, every success in your studies. I look forward to seeing you next time.